This is The Language of Business, a show to inform and inspire entrepreneurs and anyone thinking about a startup. Hear about strategies that work and strategies that often don't work from people who've been there and done that. Our host is Gregory Stoller, Harvard MBA and senior lecturer at Boston University Questrom School of Business. Here's Greg Stoller.
A jury is made up of 12 people whose job it is to determine who has the better lawyer. We're on location in Boston with Bruce Singal, who is the co-chair of the litigation practice at Barrett and Singal, and welcome to The Language of Business.
Thank you for having me.
Why do people lie, steal, and cheat in business?
They believe they can get away with it and that they're smarter than anybody else.
And he, she, or they who has the better attorney or an inept prosecutor, are they able to actually do that?
Well, Bernie Madoff, for example, one of the biggest con men in history, stole about $69 billion, that's with the B dollars, and were it not for my client, I'm proud to say, Harry Markopolos, who outed him at the SEC, but for Harry's persistence, he would have gone unscathed.
And what do you mean by that?
We went to the SEC here in Boston to try to out him. They were uninterested initially, and only because Harry persisted in these efforts and went to New York did he get the SEC to pursue Madoff. Had it not been for Harry's persistence, Madoff would have gotten away with it.
And do you think that's the exception rather than the rule?
I do. I think it's the exception, but not the only exception. There were certainly others.
You started your career off as a prosecutor. Tell us about that.
Well, as a prosecutor, my job for a good part of that time was to investigate and prosecute major fraud cases. And I got to see some highly skilled con men in that position. I think they fall principally into two categories. There is the hardcore con man who either is incapable of telling the truth or doesn't know the difference between what's true and what's false, and by his or her very nature seeks to deceive and mislead people for his own great gain. The second category, and we've seen quite a few of these in people we've represented, is more benign in that they are people who are not by nature hardcore con men, but they get caught up in a corporate environment that they are not able to resist. And so, contrary to their normal instincts, they are swept into a fraudulent scheme.
And when you say swept in, I mean, ostensibly people are smart, they know right from wrong. Is it because they're fearful of losing their job? Are they looking for their hand to be in their pocket and get a payday? What are your thoughts on that?
In the second category, it's less often greed than it is concern for personal and family circumstances. Keeping their job, not being able to resist the peer pressure in the corporate environment, those kinds of things.
What are some of your more famous cases?
Well, in terms of the world of fraud, probably the best con man I encountered was a fellow named Reginald Bernard Chisholm, and he got millions of dollars from people for selling purported interest in jojoba bean plantations. He sold this because jojoba is a very valuable commodity that goes in all sorts of cleaning products. And he would show people pictures of these beautiful plantations with jojoba beans growing on them and telling them that everybody needs this jojoba. And he was so charismatic that people parted with their money willy-nilly to him. The only problem is he himself had no ownership interest in the jojoba bean plantations, so as a result, people were paying for nothing.
You said earlier that people get off for one of two reasons, either a very skilled defense attorney or an inept prosecutor. Which do you think is more prevalent these days?
Probably skilled defense lawyer, but there's really another reason, and sometimes they're just not apprehended or detected at all, and so they don't even get prosecuted.
What would be your advice to someone who feels that they are about to get caught up in something that just doesn't feel right?
Somebody on the receiving end, in
Correct.
other words. If it's the old saying, if it looks too good to be true, don't do it.
And how about somebody who is on the aggressor's end, who just senses this absolute opportunity and figures, as you put it, that they're smarter than everybody else and isn't going to get caught?
You're probably not as smart as you think. I can give you an example of probably the best. I gave you an example from personal experience. I can give you an example of the probably one of the greatest con men in history, was a fellow named George Walker, who in the early 1900s, you know the expression, do you want to buy a bridge?
Right.
Well, he literally sold the Brooklyn Bridge, not once, but twice, to people who thought they were really buying it. Not content with that, he then went on to sell Madison Square Garden and the Statue of Liberty as well. And finally, in maybe his most audacious attempt, he told people that he was the grandson of President Ulysses Grant and attempted to sell Grant's tomb.
How do you draw the line between representing somebody versus getting personally caught up in a story?
Either as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer, you cannot get emotionally wrapped up to the point where you are losing your detachment, your professional detachment. And I will say, I have seen prosecutors in particularly sympathetic case with very sympathetic victims and very unsympathetic fraudsters, alleged fraudsters. I've seen situations where the prosecutors have at times gotten too emotionally involved.
Bruce, thank you.
My pleasure.
Bruce Singal, co-chair of the litigation practice here at Barrett and Singal in Boston, Massachusetts. You tell your work friend a juicy secret, but then it comes back to bite you. Once bitten, twice shy, or is this a trend? We're on location in Wellesley with Elaine Eisenman, author of the recently released book, Betrayed, and welcome to the Language of Business.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Once bitten, twice shy, or a trend?
Probably a trend.
Why?
First of all, it's important to understand that there are no friends in business. So you may have a work colleague, you may have a work partner, but the word friend denotes that you can trust this person. And in an organization, trust has its limits.
Across the board? Every organization, every person, every relationship?
Every organization, every person, every place you go.
Even when things are going well?
Even when things are going well, particularly when things are going well. So in our book, Betrayed, we interviewed over 50 people who have been betrayed both personally and professionally, and discovered that betrayal is the shadow companion of trust. And when you look at trust, too often people have blind trust in their work colleagues and believe they're friends, forgetting that everybody often has the same desire for self-promotion and advancement, and sometimes that gets in the way of friendship.
What I find interesting about your book is it is absolutely counter to the prevailing wisdom that every story has three sides to it, his side, her side of the truth. It sounds like in this case, every person has actually been betrayed.
And what we found is every person we spoke to was betrayed, and they were eager to tell their story.
And didn't deserve it, by the way.
And believed that they didn't deserve it. We were not in a position to determine whether or not they deserved it, but truly did not deserve it because it caught them by surprise.
So what is an obvious takeaway? Keep your mouth shut in the office?
An obvious takeaway is listen to your gut, number one, which is look for red flags. And never believe that people in your office are dear friends who will keep secrets. Your best friends should be outside and have been proven over the test of time. Work friends come and go. They are not consistent over time.
But your outside friends aren't going to know the politics. They're not going to know the context of the organization. Isn't it human nature to want to talk a little bit about something bothering you in the office?
It is human nature to want to talk about virtually everything. Things you talk about should never be things that can come to haunt you at a later point. While outside friends may not know the context and the politics, typically outside friends have similar involvements and similar engagements in other companies, and they can provide a good, objective, independent assessment, kind of like a board of directors. Boards of directors don't work in the company in which they're an independent director, but they know enough to be able to give an outside opinion.
You mentioned the term blind trust. Do you think your spouse or significant other is going to be objective enough to be a sounding board? I notice you haven't mentioned that in terms of your outside friend circle.
So I don't believe, for the most part, that your mother or your spouse or your significant other is objective enough to provide significant, consistent information. I believe they have your best interest in mind. Although in betrayal, we saw many situations where the spouse betrayed another spouse. As long as you're not work partners. We have one story in the book, one person that we interviewed whose spouse betrayed them in a work situation. They worked in the same large organization. They were not in any way in the same department, but the spouse who was betrayed provided information to the spouse, pillow talk as it were, that then got used against her when that spouse told his superior.
How does karma factor into all of this?
So we have a wonderful story about karma, and what we found is karma is really the best form of revenge. That if you throw it out to the universe and revenge happens, that's karmic revenge. One of our favorite betrayal stories is a story that happened a number of years ago. Very, very successful woman lawyer who worked in a firm where the partner did not believe there should be women partners, the managing partner. And she had a track record of significant success, and after each success, the managing partner would say, next time, next time. Well, finally, next time came, and she won a very, very significant case that no one expected her to win. And the partner had promised her that this would be the case that would earn her partnership. When she went to talk to the partner and say, now, he said, well, there's a problem. You're pregnant, and you're a woman, and pregnant women, mothers, have no place in a law firm.
And this was not in 1975?
This was not in 1975. It was more recent than that. And so she said, that's it. I've had it. I'm finding another firm, and literally packed her bags and walked out that day. As she was walking out the door, the executive assistant of the senior partner, the managing partner, said to her, I've seen this happen one too many times. I am completely fed up. Here's a file with the names and situations of every woman this has happened to. The woman took the file, didn't do anything with it, decided to focus on her pregnancy at the moment, had the baby, joined another firm as partner, and several years later she received a call from the general counsel of the White House. The managing partner was up for federal judgeship. Could she comment on his appropriateness? And she said, I have a file.
Unbelievable.
Needless to say, he never got that judgeship.
This wasn't your first book. What was the first one about?
The first book was entitled, I Didn't See It Coming, the only book you'll ever need to avoid being blindsided in business. And it focused solely on organizational politics and how to survive them, how to know when they're in play. This is a logical follow-on, Betrayed is a logical follow-on to Being Blindsided. After the first book, I said I'd never write another one. I've written Betrayed, so who knows what the future will bring.
Could a third one be in the possibilities?
Very possible.
In the same theme or genre or something else?
That seems to be something that's captivating me. One always looks at trends.
Elaine, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Elaine Eisenman, author of the recently published book, Betrayed, A Survivor's Guide. Remember that little company called Enron? Its lessons on ethics are still reverberating through the business world today. Welcome to John Lodra, former Enron employee, to the Language of Business.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
What was it like actually working for Enron?
It was actually quite a different experience than the headline news and kind of documentary stories that were made of the whole affair. I will say, and I agree to this day, that there were a tremendous amount of very talented, good people at Enron, and I think it's a classic example of just a few bad actors can really spoil the waters for not only outsiders but insiders as well. There were folks within that company that believed in the company. There were divisions of the company were legitimately adding value and had a place for being in the business world. And it all obviously came crumbling down as a result of some pretty poor judgment at the C-suite offices of that company.
Did one day you receive an email that the company had shut down and you were out of a job?
No, it was a bit more sequential than that. Certainly the stock price started to portend that something wasn't quite right. And investors started asking some more challenging questions of Enron's financials. And as that started to kind of snowball, kind of a light switch went off as counterparties of
Houston,
Enron.
we have a problem.
Yeah, it was kind of an overnight thing in that sense, in that once counterparties decided to not trade with Enron. Enron was largely a trading company, everything from energy commodities to other esoteric things like internet bandwidth. Once the trading counterparties started to get cold feet, it was kind of like the modern day equivalent of a run on a bank.
Sure.
Fast forward to today and you're running your own shop. How do you employ those lessons in everyday business life?
I've got 2 college-age children who are kind of looking out at the world, and I keep telling them that you got to do the little things right. If you cut corners and kind of cheat or lie on the little things, when the decisions come about that really matter, you're going to be trained and practiced into not making good decisions. So, I in the businesses I run, I just try to every day, act and speak in truth. I think that's one of the most fundamental elements of freedom and personal choice and freedom is to be given the truth, from which you can make the decisions that either as a customer or a seller. Without truth, we don't have much of anything.
Putting on your academic hat as opposed to your business or legal hat, why do people lie, steal, and cheat in business?
It's short-sighted and easy. Oftentimes there is groupthink, peer pressure, you might say, and courage is something that oftentimes is in scarce commodity because of oftentimes the short-sighted nature of business. It's all about getting the next promotion or the next sale without really thinking through the consequences of what pathway to get that next step in business, whether it's self-interest or what.
Have you ever seen someone permanently get away with it?
No, I don't believe so. I think in one way or the other, it comes back to roost. I do believe in psychic income and karma.
Yeah, exactly
absolutely.
right.
No, it's I think and certainly you see the stories of folks who die with billions of dollars and look back on their life and wish they had done things differently. So I think ultimately it becomes one of one's own introspection of their legacy.
Sure.
There's a fine line between what is universally accepted as business ethics and not.
You mentioned while working for Enron that some of the headlines were misguided. How much of lying, stealing, and cheating in business is fact versus fiction?
Well, there's always more layers to the onion, right?
Right.
It's certainly a lot of lying and cheating starts innocently, but that's to my point of what I usually tell my kids. It's like never too late to come clean on a decision that maybe in hindsight wasn't the right one or was downright unethical. Our modern press is looking for the "I gotcha" kind of caught red-handed. There's usually some more layers and texture to that, and I think everybody deserves the right to come clean and be truthful. Without truth, we don't have much of anything.
How would your advice change to one of your children or a new employee?
Wouldn't change at all. A company is essentially a family in a real way. It's a business family. Sometimes you're spending more time with your business family than your biological family. I see no real difference. There's roles for leaders to be mentors and leaders by example, and so I don't really see a fundamental difference.
What advice would you have for someone who comes to you and wants to be a whistleblower?
Well, I'd say thank you for displaying this courage, but I would say absolutely do the right thing, go for it. It may not be immediately apparent, but there are many more people that support doing the right thing. That is healthy because of, for example, whistleblowers now have the foundation in place to have an impact when things are going wrong.
John, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. My pleasure.
John Lodra, managing partner of New Harbor Financial and Mad River Associates and former Enron employee, but more importantly, someone who permanently wants to do good in the world when it comes to his clients, business partners, and children.
I
I didn't even realize what it meant to be in a top-tier business school until my first day. And I just really, for the first time, felt like I was in a place where everybody knew what was going on and everyone was incredibly driven to study this and perfect this field. And so I think being in a top business school really means that you are finding the barriers and the edges of the field and pushing them a little farther. And that's what Questrom has taught me over the past 4 years.
The curriculum at Questrom's really helpful because you get to not only study the basics of business, such as accounting or marketing, but you really get to dive further in and to see applications of the health sector and how business applies to sustainability efforts around the world.
They really want us to kind of focus it on 4 emerging areas, and those areas were healthcare, security, sustainability, and technology. Those are really where the jobs are going to be. They really want us to come out from the Questrom School of Business and, like I said, be able to work in any area of the industry.
It's one thing to talk about ethics with your employees or maybe even your children, but if you're teaching it in the classroom, you're bringing it to a whole new level. We're on location virtually with Peter Martin, who is a lecturer at Boston University Questrom School of Business. And Peter, welcome to the Language of Business.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Greg.
Peter, how do you teach ethics in the classroom and actually get people to pay attention?
Well, that's an excellent question because the people involved here are students. And the one thing that any parent knows and anyone else knows is that if you lecture students, you will get nowhere. So when we talk about ethics, when we talk about honesty in business and elsewhere, to students, it cannot take the form of a lecture. Let me tell you how you should behave. Okay, are you paying attention? So the way I approach it is by talking to them about their own personal empowerment to make decisions as they relate to ethics and honesty in business. That is, I tell them that there will be circumstances under which they will have to make choices. And those choices may present themselves in the form of an opportunity either to do something proper and something improper. That they are highly unlikely to go through their careers just smoothly sailing without having any ethical or moral challenges. So I tell them to look within themselves and figure out who they are.
But Peter, we're not talking about showing them how to do financial modeling in a class or even having to do a marketing plan, short of you putting your students individually in an uncompromising position and videotaping it and saying, what did you do well, what you didn't do well? How do you try and reinforce those lessons for real?
What I do is I take them through a series of real life situations. And the real life in question is mine. And I'll say, I'm going to tell you about something that actually happened to someone, to me. Let's talk about it. And I choose some fairly dramatic, true situations. And their first reaction is, oh, come on, that doesn't really happen to people. Did that really happen to you? I'm saying, yeah. Now, what do you think I was thinking while that was happening to me?
And you come from a rich professional history well before you started teaching. You've worked for money management firms. You've worked for technology firms. Is that where you're drawing all of your experiences from?
Yes. Yeah. I've worked for very large companies, but mostly I was an entrepreneur, still am. And most of these examples come from the wild and woolly world of entrepreneurship rather than the more highly structured corporate world. And I'll get my students to try to put themselves in my shoes. The person who was asking me to do something unsavory, or the situation that was created where there was an ethical dilemma, how did that come about in real life? How did that actually happen? And what do you think I was thinking? And what moral dilemma? So I try to give them some practice across a series of different examples. And they'll always say, well, Professor, what did you do? And I'll tell you, by that point, they're interested. And I hope that I've always done the ethical thing. Okay, this is the way that I do a little bit of indirect preaching is I'll explain what I did and why I did it and the upside and the downside. And sometimes there were serious personal downsides, And I think it gives them a way of, one, appreciating that these things really happen. Ethical dilemmas and ethical decisions really will happen right in their laps, right? And that it's very much, their reaction to them is very much a function of who they are and who they want to be, and what their choice as to whether or not they want to behave at this end of the spectrum or at this end of the spectrum.
Peter, how do you know if it actually works?
Well, I haven't done a scientific study, and I don't know how I would do that except by watching my students and comparing them to some control group that managed to avoid this kind of conversation, right? But I think I can get some clues to that by what students tell me afterwards and what they include in the comments when they do our course reviews. As you know, we get reviewed. And it's not uncommon for students to say, you know, that lecture about ethics, I had never heard that stuff before. It really got me to thinking. Or a student will pull me after class and say, you know, my dad told me about something very similar. So I have these little data points that suggest to me that it is possible to get through, at least to some students, with things like this. I'll also mention, I've mentioned earlier that this has to do with personal decisions they make, but I also try to show them that it isn't only about their gains. That is, sometimes people stretch ethical boundaries for personal gain because they want to get a promotion or they want to get a raise or they're going to steal some money and it's going to go in their bank account. Sometimes people get on the shady side of town because they feel it will benefit their company or their enterprise, and that they will indirectly over time benefit from that. There are also cases we talk about where companies within an entire industry will get together and price fix or collectively put forth misinformation in order to benefit the entire industry. And I was talking to someone earlier today, and she said, you know, there might be a fourth level. The fourth level might be societal. Are there people who will behave unethically because they have a societal objective? And I haven't yet figured that one out. But as you can see, there's a lot to this topic.
Peter, what do you think the biggest issue facing people in their 20s or 30s is right now when it comes to ethics?
I think the biggest issue is that if they read the papers, if they watch politics, if they just look at their picture of life based on the channels of input that they get a lot of mixed messages. And I think that those of us who've been around for a while, we've somehow developed an ethical foundation against which we can measure these things. But I think students from their teens up through their early 30s and so on, they haven't yet formed that foundation. So they're buffeted about by a lot of different messages that contain different implicit ethical models. And I think sometimes it causes confusion. And they're not quite sure what is right anymore. They might see an industry icon behaving in one way, and that carries some legitimacy, even if that's very unethical, for instance. So I think that's one of the things that's hard on young people as they try to get their feet on the ground.
Peter, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Peter Martin, lecturer at Boston University Questrom School of Business, talking about teaching ethics to undergraduates and graduate business students.
Support for the Language of Business is from Boston University Questrom School of Business. We're also available as a podcast on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for watching.